Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie.
Welcome everyone. My name is Rabbi Miriam Klimova. I'm joining from Haifa, and today we continue our studies of the Jewish nation, and our classes are based on the book Turning Points in Jewish History.
Punkty zwrotne historii żydowskiej. Właśnie jesteśmy w
And we
bardzo,
are at a
bardzo ważnym
very
punkcie.
important
Punkcie,
point,
który odczuwamy konkretnie w
and it's
dniu
something
dzisiejszym,
that we can
ponieważ
feel
kiedy
today.
mówimy o
When we
północnej
talk about
Ameryce Żydowskiej, o
Jews from
północnej
North
Ameryki, już
America,
wiemy, jaki
we
wpływ
know
mocny
how much of an influence it
dzisiejszy
has
świat
on
żydowski.
contemporary
Już wiemy,
Jewish world.
jaką tendencję daje na przykład
For example,
zakaz
in Israel, when we talk
religijno-ojejszy
about
reformowany,
Reform
no to jest
Judaism, then it's
odnośne
still not that
słabe.
strong. When we talk
Kiedy
about
mówimy o dzisiejszym
Judaism across
świecie,
the world,
dzięki
so
Ameryce
thanks
Północnej,
to North
pierwszym
America, Reform
reformowany jest
Judaism is
judaizmem,
the
który
option
popiera
chosen by
większość Żydu
most
na świecie.
Jews across the world.
Więc pomimo ciągłych
So, in
aktualnych
spite of many
wątpliwości,
contemporary doubts
jest
about what will happen
niezgodnie
to the next
cokolwiek
generation when we
wypracowywana na
live
jakichś
in an
lat
open
czy lat
society,
Żyda,
when Jews
nie
are
jest
not bound to
zobowiązane
be
być Żydem,
Jewish,
tylko w
but
końcu
it's a
wybiera
matter of their
być
choice.
Żydem, tu właśnie
Nonetheless,
mówimy
we are
o żydowskiej
discussing
konsekwencji. Tu
North
właśnie
American
mówimy o
Jewry,
złotym
the
wieku.
golden age
Możemy
of
mówić o złotym wieku
North American Jewry.
żydostwa północnoamerykańskiego. Mówimy o epoce
So it's a time
rozkwitu
of their
pod
flourishing
względem
when it comes to
kulturowym,
their culture,
cywilizacyjnym,
religion, and many
pod
other aspects.
wieloma różnymi aspektami.
But
Ale
how
skąd
did it
to
all
wszystko bierze?
start?
Mówimy o
So
emigracji. Każda
when we
emigracja
talk about
nie
migration,
jest
well, no one
prawidłowa.
migrates because they were
To już z
really
reguły
happy with their previous
błędne.
life.
Jeżeli przyjrzymy się do historii,
So if we
to
take a
jedna
look
rzecz
at the
jest nam
history,
bardzo dobrze
we
znana,
see something that is well known
że
to us. So
jeden za
subsequent
drugim dominory
partitions of
Polski
Poland,
robią
and
tak, że
as a
tereny, na których
result of
mieszkają
that,
Żydzi,
the lands
na terytorium
inhabited by
Polski,
Jews, the Polish
stają
lands,
się
suddenly become a
imperium rosyjskim.
Russian territory.
I to właśnie wtedy
And
zaczyna
that's
się
exactly when
nowe
a new
życie.
life started for them.
Nowe
But
nie
new
znaczy
does not
zawsze
always
dobre.
mean better, because in
Ponieważ
the Russian
Imperium
Empire,
Rosyjskie
already in
jeszcze w
the 18th
XVIII
century,
wieku Katarzyna
Catherine
II
II
ustanowiła strefę
established
wpływów,
a Jewish
strefę
area,
osiedlenia. Co
the
to znaczy strefa
Pale of
osiedlenia? Nie
Settlement.
chciała, żeby
So she
migracja
didn't want the
Żydów
migration
polskich
of Polish Jews
miała
to
korzenie na ziemi
affect
rosyjskie.
the
Jeżeli tak,
lands that were
to
originally
nagle
ethnically Russian.
odkrywa się, że
But
w granicach
suddenly
rosyjskich
it turned
mieszka
out that
naprawdę duża
in
populacja żydowska.
Russia you have suddenly a
Więc
large Jewish
i
population.
w ciągu następnego stulecia
So over the next
podejmowanie
century, they
różnych
implemented
polityk
different
mających na
policies
celu
aimed at
rozwiązanie
solving the Jewish
tego
problem.
problemu żydowskiego.
And
Jakie to
what kind
będą
of
polityki?
policies?
To może być albo
For example,
przestawienie
encouraging
asymilacji,
assimilation
potem
so they'd
zapomnieć,
forget what
co
it
to
means to
znaczy
be
być Żydem,
Jewish, or
albo
conversion
konwersji,
or emigration.
albo emigracji. Tak? Jeżeli szukamy, co mogło
So,
być
if you are
powodem
looking for the
rozpoczęcia tej
reasons
emigracji,
behind
to
such a large
zawsze
wave of migration, then
kilkanaście
always
dziesięcioleci
a
wcześniej
couple of decades ago
zobaczymy
we'll see
jakieś
some
zmiany
changes in the
społeczeństwa. Jedna
society.
z najbardziej
And one
widocznych
of the
zmian
most significant
społeczeństwie i
changes,
to
a couple of
właśnie z
decades
wielką
before the
emigracją
migration,
będzie
was
efekt
the
emancypacji
serfs'
serfów
emancipation in
w
1862.
1862 roku. Co to znaczy? To znaczy, że
And what does it
młodzi
mean?
raptem
It
zwalają
means
na
that
masę
the peasants
górników,
suddenly
którzy są
are a
zubożali,
mass of
którzy
indebted
szukają ujścia
people. They are
ze swojej
impoverished
frustracji.
peasants seeking an outlet for
I
their
jeżeli
frustration.
powiemy
So, to
wprost,
speak
szukają
plainly, they are
ofiary,
looking for a
która
victim to
będzie wyjścia
blame for their
z tej
frustration
frustracji i z
and
tym,
for
co się
all
dzieje.
that is
Tak?
happening.
W tym całym biedostwie, które muszą
A victim
odczuwać
for the
każdego
poverty they
dnia.
experienced every day.
Co gorzej,
And what's
Rok
even worse, in
1881
1881, the
cesarz
Tsar
Aleksander
Alexander
II
II of the
Imperium
Russian
Rosyjskiego
Empire was
zginął z
assassinated.
rąk zamachowca. I tutaj
And
na ten
suddenly, a
kraj
wave of
ochotnie
pogroms
odpala
swept the
pogromy.
country.
Ten
This
rok
year
jest
is
bardzo
very
ważny
important
w
in the
historii
Jewish
żydowskiej.
history.
Ten
It
rok
will
będzie nam mówił o
describe the
falach
waves of
migracyjnych.
Aliyahs
Ten
to
rok będzie nam mówił o
Israel and
migracji do Stanów
about
Zjednoczonych. Ten
migration
rok będzie
to
nam
the
mówił też o
US
pogromach
and also
nad
about
Niemcami.
pogroms.
Pisał dużo o tym,
We have
jak widział
descriptions
te
of the
pogromy, jak
pogroms
opisywał,
of
jak
those who
płakał
witnessed them and who
od
were
wszystkiego,
crying
co
about them.
jego oczy widzieli. Więc Żydzi byli
So the Jews
obwiniani
were
ze
blamed by
wszystkich
all
stron
sides for
za
all
wielkiego.
the bad
No
things
i
happening
cesarza
to
również
them,
oni
and
karali.
even for
Chociaż
the
wiemy, że
assassination
to
of
nie
the
było
Tsar,
pierwsze z próbach
even though it was not the
poniżenia
first
interwencji
such
carza,
assassination
jak
attempt,
piąta czy
maybe the
szósta.
fifth or the sixth one.
Ta dynamika w stosunku do Żydów
And this dynamic
trwała
towards
i
Jews
stawała się
continued
coraz
and
bardziej
intensified until the
po
revolution
antyrewolucji
of
w
1917.
1917 roku. I ogólnie rzecz biorąc, rosyjski rząd reagował
So generally,
na
the
działania
Russian
antyżydowskie
government
przemocy
responded to violence against the Jews
raczej
by blaming the
owijając w flag,
victims.
czyli nikogo nie szukał, nie mówił,
So
ok,
they
zaraz
were
sobie
not looking
wszystko
for the
wyjaśnimy
perpetrators.
i
They did not say, okay, let's try to
popełnimy
settle
bunt.
this.
Nie,
No, no one was
nikt nikogo
defending the
nie bronił.
Jews.
I w reakcji na taką sytuację
So,
niektórzy
in
Żydzi
the face
rozeszli
of
się na
such a
dwie.
situation, when it comes to
Jedni
Russian Jews,
wkraczali do
some of
ruchu
them joined
rewolucyjnych.
some
Powiedzieli,
revolutionary
dobra,
movements. They
słuchajcie,
said, well,
skoro nas
since
chronić, to
this
chroni nas
government doesn't
zwyczajnie.
want to protect us, then why do we need them?
Niektórzy wzięli
Others joined
stanowisko.
the Zionist
Jeżeli ten
movement.
kraj
They
nie jest
said,
dla
if
nas
this country
krajem, w
is
którym
not good
możemy
for us, we
mieszkać,
cannot feel safe
wiedząc, że
here,
jesteśmy
then let's
bezpieczni,
create our own
to
country.
stworzymy swój kraj. Ale też inni starali się
Others sought to
zastosować
apply the Western
europejskie
European
doświadczenia
experience of
oświecenia,
enlightenment and
demokracji.
emancipation.
Starali
They
się
were
stać
trying to become
się
part of the
częścią
Russian
społeczeństwa
society.
rosyjskiego. Wspierali politykę
They
rządu,
were supporting the government's
rząd między
policies.
innymi
For
nałożył na
example,
szkoły
it
obowiązek włączenia świeckich
obliged
przedmiotów. To
Jews
jest
to
dla
include
nas
secular
powiedzmy duże, ale
subjects
dla
in
nich to
Jewish
już było
schools,
jakieś
which seems
wkraczanie
okay, but
do
that
norm,
was a change,
które
an
były dla nich
imposition of new norms,
niezwyciężalne,
because before Jews
raczej pragnęli być
wanted
państwem
to be a
państwem.
state within a state
I tak
without
czy
outside
inaczej, po
influences.
wielu próbach zrobić sobie
They tried to
wyborowych
have
rabinów,
crown rabbis,
nic z tego
but
nie wyszło.
that did not
Pogromy
help.
były
You still
dalej.
had
Po
pogroms.
pogromach w
So, after the
1881 roku
pogroms
stało
after
się
1881, it
takie
became clear that
rozwiązanie,
such
które nie
solutions
doprowadzą do
would
niczego.
not be effective.
I tutaj
And
właśnie,
here,
idąc
emigration became
ścieżką
the
wsteczną
only path,
imigrację,
and quickly it
która
developed
szybko
into a mass
przekształca
phenomenon.
zjawisko masowe. Jeżeli sobie przypomnimy, co w tym samym czasie
And let's
dzieje się w
remind
Stanach,
ourselves what was
bo
happening
nie wiem,
in
czy
the
tam
US in
byłem
the
kiedy
same
Żyda. Wiem,
times.
że
So you
jeździłam
already
kiedyś
had Jews over
wcześniej
there.
na naszych
We
spotkaniach,
talked
kiedy
about
byliśmy
Reform
tam
Judaism,
nieraz
about
zamożnymi
Geiger before,
imigranci.
and we also
Powiedzieliśmy
briefly
też tylko
mentioned
o
how
tym, jak
Reform
wyraźnie reformowane
Judaism
byli
migrated from
domowe Żydzy
Germany
z
also to
Niemiec
the
do
United
Stanów.
States. So
Czyli
you
była
also
to
had a
jeszcze
migration of Jews
imigracja
from
Żydów
Central Europe
z
to the
Europy
United States
Środkowej
even
do
earlier.
Stanów Zjednoczonych jeszcze wcześniej.
And then they would
Też
establish their
zakładają swoje
institutions, for
instytucje,
example, Hebrew
wiemy
Union College,
Hebrew
the
Union College,
rabbinical seminary
szkoła
that
rabinacka,
is still
która
educating
rozwijanie się, czyli
rabbis up
wykształca
until
rabinów w
today, both
Stanach
in the
Zjednoczonych, także
US
w
and in
Izraelu.
Israel. It
Była
was
założona w
established in
1889
1875,
roku,
so over
czyli ponad
150
150
years
lat
ago.
temu.
So you
Czyli
already had
Żydzi
Jews
tam
there.
mieszkali,
They were
jeżeli
already
już rozwijali
establishing their
swoje instytucje.
institutions.
W
In
1886
1886, the
roku
yeshiva Etz
to
Haim
ta
was
Yeshiva Etz
opened.
Haim, dlaczego jest ważna?
And this is
Ponieważ
important
stało się
because it
prekursorką
was
tego, co później
a
będzie
prelude
nazywane
to
Yeshiva
what
University,
was established
czyli
later, the
oferowała
Yeshiva University,
raptem
and it would offer traditional studies along with the secular
tak? Czyli coś
subjects.
jest,
So
jakaś
this is
neoortodoksja,
a
to już jest jakieś coś
neo-orthodoxy. It was
postępowe,
something
tak?
progressive.
Studia
You also
były
had
też tą
secular
rzeczą.
topics.
W tym samym
In the
czasie,
same time, in 1888,
1888 rok, tak?
so we,
Jeszcze w Rosji tam nie
here
wiadomo co, a
the
tutaj
Jewish Publication
założenie
Society was
Polish
founded.
Society,
So we have
czyli mamy
a
druk
Jewish
literacki w
press,
Ameryce
a
Północnej.
publishing company. So
Zupełnie inne
this
życie wspólnoty
changed
żydowskiej.
the life of the Jewish community.
1891
In
założona została
1895,
pierwsza
the first
konfederacja i założona została
Jewish
w Bostonu.
Federation,
Jeżeli
charity was
śledzicie trochę
established,
tego wydarzeń w
Federated Jewish
Bostonie, to
Charities of
wiadomo, że
Boston.
byli
And why in
w
Boston?
pierwszych latach
Because
października właśnie
after Jews would
do portu przyjechali,
disembark, they would settle
pracowali
close to the
niedaleko do
port.
portu.
That's why the
Więc tam
largest Jewish
największe
communities
środowisko żydowskie, najliczniejsze
are,
będzie
of course, in New York, in
oczywiście Nowy
Boston,
Jork,
and
Boston.
now also
Będzie
Florida.
to teraz też Floryda.
Today it's
Będzie
also
się też
California.
Kalifornia.
But
Ale
Boston
właśnie Boston
becomes the
stanie
first
się
place
pierwszym
where
miejscem, w
the
którym otwiera się
Federated
Federacja
Jewish
Żydowska.
Charities was opened,
Teraz
and
jest
now such a
umiejscowienie
federation
w
exists in
każdym
almost
regionie.
every
Prawo
US
wspiera jako
states, and it supports Jewish
kongregacje
congregations and
żydowskie i
Jewish
organizacje żydowskie,
organizations
które
that are
działają
active in
w
that
samym
region.
regionie i też
And they also
wspierają
support
różne
various
inicjatywy
initiatives
i
also in
w samym
Israel itself,
Izraelu
but
i
also in
też
many other
w
places
różnych
around the
końcach
world.
świata. Tak,
Various
różne
Jewish initiatives and
inicjatywy żydowskie,
projects,
projekty
also
żydowskie,
in Europe and
nie
other
tylko w
places.
Europie czy w innym miejscu.
And now let's go back
Wracamy
from this
z
beautiful
tego pięknego
world
świata.
and
Dlaczego?
let's take a look at
Dlaczego
what's
co dzieje
happening
się z
with
tą,
this enormous
z tą
number of
ogromną
Jews
liczbą
who
Żydów, którzy mieszkają
before would
teraz,
live in
wcześniej
Poland,
mieszkali, gdy
and
stali w
now
Polsce,
they
teraz
live
mieszkają,
or they
przejeżdżając do
migrate
Izraela,
from the
do
Russian
rosyjskiego.
Empire.
Rząd
So
rosyjski
the Russian
ogłasza
government
ustawę majową
promulgates the May laws in
1882 rok,
1882.
tak? Czyli rok
It
po
was
tym,
1 year
jak
after the
poprzedni car
previous Tsar
zginął,
was killed, and the
następny
next one,
Aleksander III,
Alexander the
ten drugi,
Third,
wygłasza nowe ograniczenia. I
imposes
w ogóle
these laws,
historycy
and
rosyjscy opisują
historians
bardzo
said
dużo
that
antysemityzmu w tych
there was a lot of
ogłoszeniach. Ale co to są
anti-Semitism
za
in
ustawy
these
majowe?
laws.
Ten
So
dom, z którego nie
Jews
osiedlenia,
in the Pale of Settlement,
strefa, w
so
której
they were supposed to live there, they
budowniczy
couldn't move
nie mogą
further
przesuwać
east,
się dalej na
and they
wschód,
were forbidden from
zabroniono
settling
osiedlania się
in
na takich
rural
miejscach,
areas,
czyli
so no
ziemi,
land.
coś tam,
They
nic.
couldn't buy real
Nabywanie
estate
nieruchomości, które
outside
tam jest
of
tytułami
towns and
miastami
cities.
oraz
They couldn't buy the
kupowanie
land,
samej
they
ziemi, tak?
couldn't
Prowadzenie
conduct
handlu
business on
etnicznym,
Sundays and
chrześcijańskim,
Christian holidays.
ale że też były
But this
tylko
was just the
początkiem,
beginning,
ponieważ
because at
dalej
a later
też
time the
oznaki
restrictions were
ograniczenia te były
changed and they were
wykonywane i
supplemented by the
wypełniane
central
przez władze
authorities. So,
centralne.
for example, in
Tak na przykład już w
1887, every
1987
Jew
roku
who lived in the
ważne
rural
rzeczy były
areas
nieszczupłe.
was
Wcześniej
forbidden from
zakazane
moving
było
from
nawet
one village to
rozwijanie
another.
się do innych. Czyli po prostu jak niby zwrócili chłopskie
So
prawo,
it's like they
ale tylko dla białych.
reintroduced the
Nie można było
laws
się nigdzie
regarding
mieszać.
peasants, but just regarding to the Jews, so they could not move around.
1891 rok też był
1891 was
bardzo
also an important
znaczący.
year. All the
Zostało
Jews were expelled
wydane
from
z
Moscow by a
dekretu
governmental
rządowym,
decree. So thousands of
że
them became
ich wszędzie
refugees.
stają się uchodźcami. I tutaj właśnie odczuwamy, że Stany Zjednoczone
And here we see that
zaczynają działać.
those in the United States started to
Jest
act. There was a
koalicja
coalition of
amerykańskich
American
organizacji
Jewish
żydowskich,
organizations who
które
established an
zakładają
American
Komitet
Committee for
Poprawy
ameliorating
Sytuacji
the condition
Rosyjskich
of Russian
Uchodźców.
exiles.
Nie patrząc na to, że imigranci, którzy
So
się
the migrants
osiedlili w
who
Stanach
settled in the
Zjednoczonych,
US were
budowując swoje
building their
nowe
own
życie,
life, but
nadal
nonetheless, the ties
częściowymi
between
między
Europe,
Europą
Western and Eastern, and
Zachodnią,
between
między
this new
teraz
land
Nową Ziemią
still existed.
nadal istnieją. Było
There were
bardzo
many interesting
ciekawe i
ideas on how to
spektakularne
help these
pomysł tym
people,
ludziom,
And one such idea in 1892, when Baron de Hirsch, a German Jewish millionaire, agrees to finance the transfer of 3 million Jews to Argentina. In the end, about 10,000 migrate there.
Teraz możemy sobie też wyobrazić, skąd Żydy trafiają.
Let's emphasize that Jews also ended up in South America. During my rabbinical studies, I met a colleague who made an aliyah from Brazil. And I told him I'm from Lviv. And he said, me too. I didn't understand. And he said, my grandfather migrated to Brazil from Lviv. So most of the Jews that we meet there also came from those lands. 1897, the first Russian census, and it turned out that 5.2 million Jews lived on the territory of the Russian Empire, and this was the largest Jewish community in the world. And these are also the lands after the partition of Poland. And this in the context of all the awful restrictions imposed on Jews. Already at the end of the 19th century, Jews in the West who were appalled by the persecutions taking place in the east of Europe organized a demonstration, a protest. Did they help anyone? Well, not that much. For example, you had demonstration in London, and when the authorities saw that, they said, okay, we'll tell the Russian Empire to, settle all the problems. They will tell the ambassadors to convey their concern. So they would convey all the protests on the hands of the ambassador, and of course, they would ignore them. So nothing really came out of that. So I guess the 1880s and the 1890s, that was still too early, but well, it was a good beginning. Then, as we see, they created various organizations, for example, in London in 1882 or in New York in 1881. And they are supposed to be an answer to the needs of Jewish migrants, those who needed to migrate and be able to reach the new land and there to find a home, a job.
Jeżeli mówimy o tym, co się dzieje po pogromach w 1981 roku, to widzimy, że
So after the 1881 pogroms, we see that the immigration numbers to the United States began to grow significantly. So between the 1900 and 1910, reaching an average of 82,000 Russian Jews per year. So it's a really big number. So most of the migrants would stay in large cities, especially on the coast. So a lot of new workforce, new culture, and we see that everything is open: education, social benefits. You can achieve anything you want. But on the other hand, we know that migrants always have a problem with the new language, with the culture, because these were not well-educated people with a university degree, but these were people who not so long ago were not allowed to move from one village to another.
Więc tutaj na pewno warto też wspomnieć, że zmienia się sama
So the very understanding of a new country changes because a new concept appears. So for Jews, the idea that the national identity can be based on ideology, not on ethnicity or religion, that is already a revolution. In no other place, in no other era across the centuries, something like that never happened in our history. For someone to just say, okay, I'm a Jew, and no one would react negatively. They would just say, okay. So the perspective of a new life in such a city was maybe even experienced as some kind of a messianic time. So as we see, after the pogroms, it was 82,000 migrants per year. So this was a large number of migrants. So as we said, even before 1881, you already had Jews living in the US. It was around 200,000. And now suddenly every year they are supposed to accept 82,000 new migrants. They were mostly migrants from Central Europe. And the ones who came before, like in the middle of the century, already were well established and integrated. Some had become wealthy. So they responded to the new influx with ambivalence. On the one hand, they felt obligated to help their brethren because they were suffering. They would help them to leave Russia while they were impoverished. So they were building and supporting institutions. They were helping them with education, training, health, and social welfare. But at the same time, even when you feel like you need to support your fellow Jews, nonetheless, it was difficult for them because they saw this massive immigration of poor Jews as something of an embarrassment. What will they think about Jews now when they see all these poor people? And they saw it even as a threat to their accepted status because they were already accepted within the American society. And now suddenly you have this large wave of migration. So hence some tried to prevent or restrict the entry of Jewish migrants. And others were trying to send them a bit further to the west, so as not to have too many of them on the East Coast.
Jeżeli mówimy o tym, co naprawdę stało się dla tych imigrantów podstawą.
So what became the basis of a happy life for those migrants? Because today we no longer distinguish because the first and the second wave of migration, we can say that three interrelated aspects of American society had significant impact on how Jewish life developed in the new setting. Because, okay, let's say we have the first wave of migrants, the first generation, so it will always be a bit more difficult. They will not always know the language, or it will not always be easy to find work. But Despite all these barriers, nonetheless, in the United States, you have social mobility to a much greater extent than in Russia or anywhere else. So, to the immigrants, it was an article of faith that if parents work very hard, they can be sure that their children will have access to education, they will have a new life. And that actually happened, that their children in the second generation would become doctors, lawyers, or cap captains of industry. For a Yiddish mama, for a Jewish mother, that was all she could dream of. Maybe her life was not easy or sweet, but they saw that here you truly have mobility, that they can be well educated and become influential in the larger American society. Another important aspect was freedom. On the one hand, you do not have a social Jewish hierarchy, so there is no control over the members of a congregation. There is no authoritarian government. So the individual faced an unlimited choice when it comes to unlimited choice related to spiritual, social, political, and intellectual matters. They could define themselves, what organization they wanted to belong to. So, who are you? They could say, I'm a Jew, or I'm an Orthodox, or a Reform, a socialist, an atheist. Yes, I am a Jew and an atheist at the same time. Someone could say, I'm a socialist or a Reform Jew, and so on and so on. So this freedom, on the one hand, gave them a sense of confidence in their own choices because it was their choice, but that, on the other hand, it was also easy to feel a bit lost. And the third aspect was openness. Here we have diversity. No one could say that they have authority over Jews, neither from inside or from the outside of the community. But also there was a lack of unity. That was another side of it. So as a result, you have to set your own moral norms. But you see that you cannot force people to join your community, but you have to interest them, you have to convince them that there is something good in being part of the Jewish community. As for the feelings of the new migrants, this is shown in a periodical, the Jewish Daily Forward. So they started their own daily. The editor was a gentleman called Kahan, and they also had a column with advice to the readers, and they would have this advice column, a Bintel brief, and they would publish texts that reflected the immigrant experience. Some of them were painful. And here is what one of them writes. I was born in a small town in Russia, and until I was 16, I studied in Talmud Torahs and yeshivas, but when I came to America, I changed quickly. I was influenced by the progressive newspapers, the literature. I developed spiritually and became a free thinker. I meet with free-thinking,
którzy też
progressive
są
people.
wolnomyślicielami o postępowych poglądach
I feel comfortable
i
in their
czuję się
company
dobrze w ich
and agree with their
towarzystwie i
convictions.
zgadzam się z ich przekonaniami.
Barbara, could
Czy
you
mogę Pani Barbaro poprosić
continue
o to,
reading this text?
kontynuować ten tekst? Tylko otworzyć mikrofon.
Przeczytać?
Tak, tak.
Ale gdzie, w którym miejscu?
A teraz.
Od początku? Jednak
Tak.
natura moich
But the
odczuć jest
nature of my
niezwykła.
feelings is
Posłuchajcie mnie
remarkable.
państwo.
Listen to
Każdego
me.
roku,
Every
gdy
year, when the
nadchodzi
month of
miesiąc Elul
Elul
i
rolls
zbliża się
around, when the
okres
time of
Rosh
Rosh
Hashanah
Hashanah and Yom
i Jom
Kippur
Kippur,
approaches,
moje
my
serce
heart
staje się
grows heavy
ciężkie
and
i
sad.
smutne.
A
Ogarnia
melancholy
mnie
descends on
melancholia.
me, a longing
Tęsknota
gnaws
gryzie
at my
mi
breast.
pierś.
At that
W tym
time, I
czasie
cannot
nie
rest.
mogę
I wander
odpocząć.
about through the
Błąkam
streets,
się po
lost in
ulicach,
thought,
zagubiony
depressed.
w myślach, przygnębiony. Kiedy w tych dniach przechodzę obok synagogi i słyszę kantora intonującego pieśń
When in
modlitwy,
those
staję się
days,
bardzo posępny,
I
a moja depresja jest tak wielka, że nie
I
mogę
wander through the
usnąć.
streets, lost in
Wracam
thought,
pamięcią do szczęśliwych
depressed.
lat dzieciństwa. Wyraźnie widzę przed sobą małe miasteczko, pola,
When I go
niebieskie
past the
stawki,
synagogue
lasy
during
i
these
niebo.
days and hear a cantor chanting the melodies of the
Jeszcze.
prayers, I become very gloomy and my
Przypominam sobie
depression is so
przyjaciół z
great that I
dzieciństwa,
cannot
naszą
endure it.
słodką
My
dziecięcą
memory
ziemię.
goes back to my happy
Pamiętam,
childhood
było
years. I see
Tak, tak,
clearly
tak, tak,
before me
tak.
the small town, the fields, the little
naszą
pond,
słodką dziecięcą wiarę.
and the woods around it. I
Serce
recall
moje
my
jest
childhood
śliskie jak
friends and our
napięte
sweet
przełamy.
childlike faith. My heart is constricted and I
Płyną
begin
łzy,
to run
a
like a
wtem staję
madman
się
till the tears stream
spokojniejszy.
from my
Te
eyes and then
emocje
I
i
become
nastroje stały
calmer.
się
These
silniejsze i
emotions and
biorę.
these moods have become stronger over
Postanowiłem
the
pójść do
years, and
synagogi.
I decided to
Poszedłem nie
go to
po
the
to,
synagogue. I
by
went
modlić
not
się
in
dla
order to
Boga,
pray to
ale by
God, but to heal
uleczyć
and
jak
refresh my
zwyczkło
aching
rozbolaną
soul
duszę
with the
słodkim
cantor's
śpiewem
sweet melodies,
kantora,
and this had
co
an
miało na mnie
unusually good
niezwykle
effect on me.
dobry wpływ. Te
Jeszcze.
emocje i nastroje stały się silniejsze z biegiem lat i to już to samo.
A, tak, tak. Tutaj.
A gdzie można się
And where
ukryć w
can one
Jom
hide on
Kippur?
Yom Kippur?
Jest
There are
nas
many of
wielu,
us like
takich jak
me.
ja.
They
Nie
don't go
chodzą
to
do
work,
pracy.
so it would be
Aby,
good if there
aby
could be a
było
meeting hall where there
dobrze,
could
gdyby
gather,
była jakaś
where they
sala
could gather to
spotkań, gdzie
hear a
moglibyśmy
concert, a
zebrać,
lecture, or something
aby
else.
wysłuchać koncertów, wykładu lub czegoś innego.
Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo. Tak, czyli raptem tak prostych
So,
słowach
these
od
simple,
serca
heartfelt
emigranta,
words,
tak,
words of a
dokładnie podobnie jak
migrant,
autor
and
tego listu,
probably
wielu
many other
imigrantów
migrants also
doświadczyło
experienced
w Ameryce i
in the United States,
duchownej ambiwalencji z
spiritual
jednej strony,
ambivalence. On the
możliwe
one
było
hand, this spiritual
emigrować,
life,
gdzie wszystko jest
emancipation, everything
dozwolone,
is
wszystko jest otwarte, a z drugiej
available,
strony
limitless. But
emigracja
on the other
do
hand, they are missing the small
miasteczka małego.
town. They are
Brak
missing
tego,
what
co
was happening
działo
there, that
wtedy
spiritual
w tej
home.
duchowego domu. Tak? W latach
So from 1880 to 1930,
1930
over 2.2
mówimy o tym,
million
że
Jews
bracia z
left
Danii
Russia
militarnej
to go
Żydów
to North
wyjechało z Rosji do
America.
Ameryki
Just
Północnej.
imagine that.
Wyobraźcie sobie, tak? O ile
That's an enormous number,
tak, w tych czasach,
especially back then.
jaka
This
ogromna
was a
częstość.
large community.
Mówimy o tym, że właśnie do roku 1924
So up to 1924, every year the migration wave was enormous. But in 1924, a strict restriction was introduced on migration, and the Jewish migration drops. It was 119,000 in 1921, whereas in 1925 it was 10,000, so 120,000 versus 10,000. That was the result of the strict restriction, and it was imposed on all migration, not just Jewish migration.
patrzymy się na to, widzimy, że wielka fala migracji do Stanów.
So we see that this new wave of migration to the United States created a new center of Jewish life across the world.
Musimy podkreślić, że jeżeli wcześniej do 80 roku
So before,
3% stanowili
until 1880, the Jews living in the USA
populacji żydowskiej w świecie,
represented only 3% of the global Jewish population. In 1920, it was already 23%, and it was before Shoah, before this catastrophe, before the Second World War.
I ta transformacja ma coś większego
So this transformation, it's not only important in terms of demography, who lives where. We have new challenges, a new life.
Tutaj mówimy o tym, że budują się właśnie odpowiedź
We
na
have reactions to a new reality, to a new understanding of what it means to be Jewish and to be a modern Jew. So we are continuing the reform concept. We have no other choice because we no longer live in a shtetl. We are no longer limited because there is emancipation, and especially here in the US, we are not limited by anything. And that's why we have Judaism reform, conservative, reconstructionist Judaism, all these movements. Orthodoxy exists in the US, but it's always the minority.
Powiedzieliśmy, jeżeli robimy jakieś podsumowanie,
so if we try to sum up this topic, we will say that Jews have adapted to the American society because for them it was a wonderful land. It was a society based on one's own free will, one's own choice, based on voluntary actions. It was based on individual interests of every single person when it comes to culture, social action, all such spheres.
Powiemy kilka słów o tym, jak kultura się rozwija.
But as we know, culture continued to develop. So when it comes to the first wave of migrants, in those times, they would start to establish their own theaters. Yiddish theater was developing in those times. They would have their own rest homes.
Był stworzony coś takiego jak borscht bell.
There was a so-called borscht belt. So it was rest homes with exhibitions where you could see various Jewish plays. At first it was all closed, hermetic, but then it would start to open up more and more. Then you had the Jewish actors appearing in Hollywood, and I'm not even mentioning doctors and lawyers. But you had Jewish culture that was viewed as American zone culture. Now if we watch any TV shows, TV series, then you very often have Jewish characters. You will have a mezuzah or a Hanukkah. If we go to a store in the US, there will be a kosher shelf where you can buy gefilte fish. So, as we said before, they had to open their own theaters in their own language. But for example, we have Seinfeld. We can say it's a Jewish TV series. It was the most popular one in the 1990s. and it is depicted in the Museum of the Jewish Nation in Tel Aviv, because it represents this enormous change, how from migrants they become so deeply rooted in the society, a living part of it, then suddenly this is simply a part of American culture, what they created. And of course, we could name many other such examples, both musicians, activists. So these are important elements. I think it's really important to remember that sometimes we forget how difficult the situation of the first migrants was. We look at people sometimes and we say, well, they're just there, they just went there. And it's quite the same in Israel when each subsequent aliyah was looking at the previous one. And the previous one would say, well, who are you? We've built this entire country. But each new wave of migration brings something new with itself. Each one can be useful, can bring something good with it. So we should, of course, treat each one of them with respect, understand how difficult their situation is. This is one nation, the Jewish people. And I think even in today, during very difficult times, difficult due to the politics and many other aspects, we should always remember that the unification was always a miracle that saved the Jewish people in every generation. Thank you very much. And now let's have a discussion.